Elon Musk just became the first trillionaire ever. Seems like every day the rich just keep getting on richer, and the poor get more and more desperate. And it seems like, according to my Instagram reels anyways, the only option is eat the rich. That said, I was a good old Southern Baptist boy. And I know from my church days that Jesus taught that as long as your heart was in the right place and you donated 10% of your income, you'd be alright. Right? The social scientist Gerhard Lenski created this graph to help visualize what an advanced agrarian society like Rome would look like. On the horizontal axis, we have our number of people, and on the vertical axis, we have the power and privilege of those people. The large majority of people live either just above subsistence or just below subsistence. The average Roman citizen is not doing well for themselves. They are either A, struggling to make it to their next meal, or they do have enough money, but any inconvenience could put them into a desperate situation. At the bottom, we have the expendables, and this is anyone who society has no need for. The criminals, the beggars, the underemployed. Next, we have the unclean and the degraded. This is anyone who is forced outside of society. You might think of lepers, for example. Then we have the peasants, who ironically support most of the system. The peasant class is living just above subsistence, and any inconvenience could swing them down into the expendable class. Next, we have the artisan class. These again support the economy. There is some debate here on whether the artisan class is actually better off than the peasant class, or are more or less in the same boat. Overall, though, they were more likely to have steady work when compared to the peasant group. The artisans were mostly employees of the next class, the merchants. Artisans worked with their hands, mostly for production, and they were basically peasants, but with steadier gigs. Now, their bosses were an interesting group. Most of them weren't super rich, but they were well off enough to occasionally throw their weight around. The elites tended to find them a really difficult group to control. Adjacent to the artisans and the merchants, we have our priests and our retainers. Priests are pretty self-explanatory, but for the retainers, you have soldiers, household servants, and officials. These are a manifold bunch, but they have one thing in common, which is they directly serve the elites. Speaking of the elites, they made the lives of others pretty miserable. For example, they would acquire land and other resources basically through legal theft and manipulation. The elites then would rent out their newly acquired farmland to tenant farmers, who would work the land for a relatively small compensation. That is assuming the elites didn't just have their slaves do it. Now, where's our Roman emperor? Well, for him, you got to go all the way up, right about here. There's our Caesar. If you've watched as many Christian debates as I have, you'll know that one of the common talking points is that Christians more or less invented charity. And for the most part, this is pretty accurate, with, some notable caveats. Within Roman culture, it was not normalized to give to the poor. There were some select groups that did it, or some that, thought it was a good thing. It just wasn't a normal thing that they did. Now, it was actually very common in Jewish society to give to the poor. In fact, Jesus is kind of an excellent example of a Jewish man who does give to the poor. It's not like giving to the poor never happened, but it was typically not done by the elites. In fact, the elites really had their own system of gift giving called Euergentism. Euergetism is basically just wealthy people distributing wealth to either the community or to individuals. But there's an important difference between what we would call charity and Euergetism. The main difference was that these were not free gifts. They were gifts that were given expecting reciprocity, expecting that the gift would, some other gift of either equal or superior value would be given back to the benefactor, the person giving. Euergetism basically was often used to fund city stuff. For example, the building of buildings, or the building of a temple, or the funding of a festival. But if they're giving this money, where's the reciprocity in it? Well, it comes down to how honor and shame plays into the Roman society. Euergetism was basically just a way to capture status. If you loved your city, sure, you'd help donate to fund something new, but you would never just give that money away to the poor. One of the interesting things about these benefactors is that they could receive honors just by promising to give money for a project. For example, if they went to their local officials and said, hey, we want to help build a temple, then they would take their names and they would write them on a stele, which is basically kind of like this big stone object. This is kind of like donating a bench to the park, except you're super, super rich and you can fund an entire building. Thanks for the seat, Mr. Allen. And officials basically did this for two reasons. One was to shame people who didn't come through with the funding. The other, though, is really interesting. It was to kind of improve confidence in the city itself, get more people to pour more money into it by seeing that, oh, it's likely this project could get done. The words of Richard Gordon really help sum up this entire subject. It is evident that the major purpose of this philanthropy is not to relieve poverty. Part of the function of philanthropic gestures is to register and naturalize the inequalities of the social system in each community. Just as the emperor's patronage and generosity marshals and orchestrates the overall hierarchy of the system as a whole, the gifts objectify the relations of respect, dependence, authority, and power upon which the entire eugetic system rests. The reality of Euergetism is that it has nothing to do with the poor and everything to do with the powerful. It's all about keeping the system the same, generating wealth within that system, and keeping the status quo exactly the way it is. So then the question becomes, what does the Bible have to say about all this? The number one thing people forget about the Bible is that the Bible is not one book. It's many books. And depending on which tradition and which faith you're a part of, the number varies. But for me, I'm Protestant, so we're going to go with 66. And those 66 books all have very varying opinions about the poor and the rich. They don't all necessarily say the exact same thing, and they all have different themes and even spiritual inclinations to the poor. So when we're talking about this, we want to keep that in mind. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through all the books of the New Testament, but we'll hit some highlights and get a pretty good idea of what it says. In Matthew chapter 11, John the Baptist sends Jesus a message. John says, "Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?" Jesus responds, saying, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them." Here, Jesus centralizes the gospel and the poor together. The people that he lists actually match up a lot with the people that Isaiah lists. Isaiah being another book that deeply cares about the poor. For Matthew's gospel, Jesus really is saying the gospel and serving the poor are thickly intertwined. Also, in Matthew chapter 6, right at the start, It reads, "So whenever you give alms, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogue and in the streets, so that you may be praised by others." This kind of inherently is a turning around of the honor and shame system built into Euergetism. I mean, it's basically saying, don't do this stuff for the praise of others. Do it because it's good. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense that Jesus is doing this, because just look at the graph. The graph is pretty clear that the majority of people are in some sort of category of not well off to poor. 25% of people are poor. So suddenly the upside downness of the kingdom that Jesus talks about a lot starts to make a lot of sense. In my opinion, James is definitely the most radical book out of the New Testament. James would almost certainly say Jesus would tweet, "Eat the rich," because for James, that's just true. Listen to some of the stuff he has to say. "Come now, you rich people, weep and wail for the miseries that are coming to you. Your riches have rotted, your clothes are moth-eaten, your gold and silver have rusted, and their rust will be evidence against you, and it will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasures for the last days. Listen, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous one who does not resist you." My God, chill, James, jeez. The writings of Paul are a bit more complicated because we really don't have that much information about how Paul thought about the poor. The biblical scholar Bruce Longenecker wrote a really good book called Remember the Poor. Longenecker breaks down how Paul is more subtly pro helping the poor. For example, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 23 through 28, Paul charges Christ followers to encourage the faint-hearted and help the weak. Be patient with all of them. Longenecker then goes on to say the term "the weak" should probably be seen to include those who were economically vulnerable. While the word weak has a wide semantic domain in Paul, it can at times include an economic dimension. Paul also goes on to describe himself as weak when describing his own economic situation. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul hammers home that people at the Lord's Supper need to be equal, both rich and poor, or they won't really be able to carry out the full spectrum of the gospel. I have many more examples I could go through, but I don't want this video to be an hour long. So overall, Paul is deeply concerned about the poor, and he considers it a fundamental part of the gospel. It's perhaps not in the same way that James does, or in the same way that Matthew or Luke thinks about it, but it's still very much there. So as you can see, the Bible has multiple thoughts and perspectives on what we should do about the rich and the poor. So how are we supposed to come to a right conclusion about it? Well, I don't know exactly, but I do think if your Christianity does not contain some sort of triumphalism for the poor, some sort of way in which the poor are brought into the kingdom in a full way that is actively happening in your lives, in our lives, then I think you might be missing the point. Well, if you made it to the end of the video, I'm very impressed. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a really blessed day. Bye. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, it says that love of money is the root of all evil. And this sounds a lot more similar to what I learned growing up. That the problem isn't the money so much, it's not having money that's the problem. The real problem is idolizing that money. And I think that's a perfectly okay theological line to take, but I don't think it's commensurate with many of the other biblical texts. I don't think it's what Luke is saying. I don't think it's what Matthew is saying. They're saying slightly different things.